Welcome csc103 class to our experimenting with JavaScript, and these are some very simple JavaScript exercises just to get you used to using variables, which we'll use in this one. This one was originally called 9a, and it goes together with one called 9b. This one just takes variables and puts them together, and then we have another one where we're going to be able to type into some fields and it'll take those variables and put them together. So I have some text started here. I have my body tags, and then I have an H1 which says variable example. I have a paragraph which is the instructions. It says click on a button to display your name. I have a button that says display name, and I'll do one other thing here, and I'll just make an H2. And what H2 is going to be is just a place to display the name, display some variables. So I'm just going to give it an ID so we can identify it. So I'll do ID equals, and I'll just call it display, and that should be in quotes like that, and then I'll close it off, and then I'll put my closing H2 tag, and there's going to be nothing inside it, so you won't see anything on your page. We have 4 lines of HTML, visible ones, H1, P, button, and H2, but we only see 3 because there's nothing inside here right now. But that's where we're going to display it. We're going to target display and display it on the page. Now if you notice again, our text looks really small, so I'm just going to give it a couple things here. I'm going to give it a body and just make our font size a little bit bigger. I'll say font-size. And I'll just give it 120%, so our font's a little bit bigger, and that made that font a little bigger. Our button is still smaller. That didn't do anything to the button, so I'm just going to copy this body one and paste that and change this to button. That way it'll target button, and it should make the font size. Now that's a lot bigger. I'll just put it down to 100 because it uses a different, it doesn't go exactly with the way the regular font size works on a page. Buttons are a little bit different, so even if I put it down to 90, it might look okay, which maybe I'll do. Or you could leave it at 100. I think I had it 100 in the instructions, but that looks okay at 90. So anyway, that's what we have, and we're going to display our name. Now this is going to be very simple, so this won't take long at all. And what I'll do is we're going to do JavaScript, and again we're going to have a function, but before we do that we're going to have variables. So let me kind of hide everything up here, and we're just going to have very simple variables. We're going to declare 2 variables, and they're going to be declared with the keyword var, and I'm just going to give it a name, and the first one is going to be called first, and then we can give it a value right away and assign it to the value of Steve. We'll just give a name, and then I'll put a semicolon to kind of end that statement, and then I'll make a separate variable, and I'll put last, and I'll just put a name in here. This is a string because we have it in quotes. You could put a number, you could put a string, and I'll just put Austin because he was the $6 million man back in the 70s. All that means is that I have a variable named first, and the value is Steve, and I have a variable named last, and the value is Austin. Now I'm not doing anything with it yet, but what we're going to do is we're going to put it together, and we're going to make it display in that H2 tag. And again, this is real simple, so we're going to make a function to do that. So I'm going to hit return twice, and I'm going to make a function with the function keyword, and then I'm going to give it a name, and I'll just call it display name, and I'll use a capital N in here, and I'm going to call this display name with a capital N, and you have to put your 2 parentheses, and then you have to put your curly braces, and then you put what's going to happen. Now what's going to happen here is we're going to display in the H2, and I'll move everything down a little bit. I'll close up the CSS, and just so I could see my H2 and just so I could see what the name is, that's all I need. And I'm going to do that whole document dot get element by ID, capital I, no capital D, only the E, the B, and the I, and then in parentheses I'm going to put the name that I'm going to display it, and it's actually the ID name is display, so I'll call it display, and that's where it's going. And what's going to happen here is we're going to do dot inner HTML. That means it'll display it to the page, and what that inner HTML is going to display is we're just going to write a little kind of a little string. It's basically going to put together first and last, and we don't have to put Steve and Austin. We could just say put together first and last, because first and last represents our variables that represent whatever value is in here. Steve, Austin, your name, whatever it could be. So I'll stretch this out a little bit so you can see it. And what we're going to do, we don't have to put quotes around this because variables do not need quotes. Only strings or text need quotes. So I'm going to say first, and to put them together we can use a plus sign, and I'm going to do plus last, and that'll put together those 2 things, and I'll put a semicolon. And what should happen when we click this button, it should run this function, and it'll put together first and last. Now I need to copy the function name, if you remember, up into my button and use an onClick event and say equals and say equals and put our double quotes, and I'll paste in my function there, so that's going to run the function. So now when I click the button, it's going to run the display name function, and it should do that. It should put together my first and last variables together. And let's try it out. And there it is. Except when it puts Steve Austin, it doesn't put a space in there. So what we can do, since we're kind of joining together these two variables with the plus sign operator, we can put a space in here. Now what you have to do is actually put a string, which is a space. That means in quotes, you have to put a space. And then you still have to, now that there's a string in between there, you still have to put another plus sign to make sure that you add it. And I'll stretch it out just so you can see it all together. You don't need the spaces on either side of the plus, but I like to put them because it just makes it easier to follow. So it's going to be the first variable plus a space plus the last variable. And what it should do is put a space in between that variable and that variable. So whatever name you put in here, if you put John Wayne, I'll put John Wayne. That's the first name that came in my head. If you put John Wayne in there, that's a new variable. Now when I do display name, it's going to put John Wayne, or your name, or whatever you put in there, it's going to put in there. So that's what variables do. They kind of, these variable names that are showing up in blue represent some other value. They could be numbers that you can make calculations with, or they could be strings that you just put together. This is very simple. That's the simplest thing you can possibly do, is just put two strings together. And what we're going to do on part 2 of this is we're going to basically have two fields that you can fill out. Instead of changing the code, the JavaScript code, you could do it right on the HTML page and fill out something to put in. So you could put different names on there and then display them. Again, it's still very simple, but it's just kind of introducing you to the way that variables work. So we're going to do the one with fields next, but before I do that, I'm going to make sure I save this here and give it a name, and I'm just going to call it 9a, because I think we were calling that 9a and 9b, and I'll just call it 9a and give it a -js, and I'll call it variable example. You could call it display name or whatever, and I'll put my last name on it, and I'll put C1M1 because that'll indicate that I'm doing these together, and I'm doing them for the video because I already did these in class. That's all this is just introducing up variables and then how to use functions on an on-click event to kind of make that happen, to put these variables together. What I'm going to do next is I'm going to start my one with the fields, and I'm going to base it right off of this. So you could keep this open because we're actually going to fork this thing and then create another one.